Boatworks today is sponsored by Total Boat and Alexseal Yacht Coatings, as well as supported by the generosity from the beautiful folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much. So welcome back, everybody. Hope you are doing well. My name is Andy with Boatworks today, and this week I'm doing a bit of an overview kind of a video, kind of hitting all of the bullet points if you're going to be considering, doing a paint job on your boat or RV, camper, or whatever it may happen to be. Basically, this is going to be all about the must-know info. So with that said, let's just get started. So the first thing I want to talk about here is the difference between a topside paint and a bottom paint. Now, bottom paints are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They are paints that are designed to be used below the waterline. Now, opposed to that are your topside paints, whether it's going to be Alexseal, Interlux, All Grip, All Craft, Total Boats, or Wet Edge. Pick your brand. Topside paints are designed to be used from the waterline up. Now, the reason you don't want to use a topside paint below the waterline is because, well, they will absorb moisture, they will bubble, and they will fail. That's just not how they were designed or intended to be used. Now, some manufacturers will say that you can use their topside paint below the waterline if the exposure that it has is very, very limited. Meaning, if you're going to take if you've got a little sailing dinghy or whatever, that for the most part it lives its life on a trailer or on a rack, and maybe once or twice a summer you throw it in the lake for an afternoon, maybe even a day, and then it comes right back out, sits back on the trailer for it to dry. In that kind of a situation, you probably would be all right, or you'd be able to get away with using a topside paint below the waterline. But anything longer than even a day, I wouldn't even push a weekend. But any time longer than that, you're most likely going to run into problems. So, bottom paints below the waterline, topside paints above the waterline. So, sandpaper, and specifically the grits. Now, when you're looking at a painting project, you're essentially going to use 3 different grit sandpapers, right? Maybe 4 if you want to include any kind of a repair process, but well, I'll touch on that here anyways. So now, just as a general rule here, whenever you're looking to sand fiberglass, whether it's to smooth it, knock it down, that kind of a thing, get the surface prepped for additional layups of more fiberglass or whatever it may happen to be, for that you're going to want to be using either 60 or 80 grit paper. Now, once you start to actually going down the road of getting into that painting process, you're going to want to key the surface. Before you lay down your fairing compound, you're going to want to key that surface or sand it with that 60 or 80 grit paper, which is kind of why I just included it here. Now, you've gone through all of your fairing process, you've sanded it down. Now, during that process, your knock down, your lay up, knock down, that kind of thing, you can still use that 60 to 80 grit paper. Now, once you have the surface pretty much where you want it, you think it's like spot on, your final sanding that you're going to do on that fairing compound prior to laying down your primer, your final sanding on that is going to be done with 150 grit paper. Reason for that, or reason for going with a more fine coarse paper, is that 60 or 80 grit, it's just going to key the surface too deep, and the primer itself isn't going to be able to fill that. So if you were to use that more coarse paper, you lay up your 2-3 coats of primer, you sand that down, you're still going to see all the little scratch marks from that coarse paper because it's just, well, the primer just wasn't able to fill it. So that's why you want to use a 150 grit on your final sanding of the fairing compound before you actually lay up your primer. Now, when you start talking about getting ready for paint, now your primer coats, you can pretty much knock all that down all the time with 150 grit. Now, once you're at that final stage of getting that primer ready for paint, this is the last sanding you're going to do. You're going to do your final sanding on that using 320 grit. And again, same kind of logic applies to this as it did before when we were talking about the primer. If you were to use a grit that was too much more coarse than that, the paint itself isn't going to be able to fill those scratch marks, and you're going to be seeing nothing but the swirl marks or scratch patterns beneath the paint. So 320 to prep the primer before you start your first coat of paint. But between your coats of paint, say if you laid up 2 coats and you wanted to kind of smooth it over, between your 2 coats, then you're going to step up to 400 grit. So real quick recap, knocking down fiberglass, 60 to 80 grit. Getting that surface prepped for for fairing compound, again, 60 to 80 grit. Your final sanding on your fairing compound before you lay down your primer is going to be 150. Your final sanding on your primer before you lay up paint is going to be 320. sanding in between coats of paint is going to be done with 400. So let's talk about tape. Now basically you're going to be using two different styles of tape here. The first one, which is this is what you refer to as like fine line tape. And essentially it's a plastic backed tape. Now whenever you're going to be looking for a nice crisp fine line, this is what you're going to want to use, and then you'll go over top of that with some other general masking tape, whether it's blue, yellow, green, really doesn't matter. Masking tape is, well, isn't really all that important. Now the way that you apply this kind of is. So for example, if you're taping off for your boot stripe or even the waterline, this is the tape you're going to want to lay down first, and this will get put down like so. Now when you do your masking tape, you're not going to want to necessarily run your masking tape right along the very top edge. So like this, that's not the way you'd want to do it, all right? What you want, oh, of course. Instead, what you want to do is you want to leave a little bit of this fine line tape exposed. Then you run your masking tape just beneath that. So you've got a little bit of a reveal right here. Now this would be taped off if you're going to be painting this area. Say again, if this was going to be the bottom line that you taped off for a boot stripe, you would repeat the same process along the top. Fine line tape goes along the top. Masking tape goes on top of that, but leaving a small reveal. So when you pull your tape, your fine line tape is actually what's going to be butted up to the area that you just painted. And in this case, this would happen to be a boot stripe. Same thing would apply if you were painting from the waterline up or waterline down. Now, one thing I do want to touch on here, because this is a question I get a lot, is how often do you have to basically retape? So for example, if you're looking at a project like this, typically the question comes along the lines of, well, if I'm going to be doing 3 coats of primer, do I need to pull the tape and retape after each coat? And personally, I don't. So the way that I would typically roll with this is I would mask everything off, again with the fine line and then the masking tape, and then I would roll out my 2 or 3 coats of primer, whether it's over 2 or 3 days. Then I'd pull that tape, let it cure. Now, remask, retape, getting ready for the paint. I'll do my 2 or 3 coats of paint, pull the tape, and then you're done. I've never seen a need for having to basically pull the tape and then remask between each and every coat. It's a waste of time. I have not found any benefit to that. So basically you can do each step of the process with the same masking, and then pull it and then move on to the next step. So the best types of rollers to use. Now this is going to be something where everybody's going to have an opinion on this. I can guarantee you someone's going to say down in the comments that, oh, I use this such and such roller from Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards or whatever, and it was cheap and it came out fantastic. Well, that's great. I personally have not had that same experience. Now generally there's 2 styles of rollers that people tend to fall into. Either they're foam rollers or which is what I prefer, like your mohair style rollers. Now, I'm gonna touch on the foam rollers first. Now, typically, every time I've used them, I've had nothing but problems. Either the foam starts to disintegrate, you get little bits of pieces, after 5–10 minutes of use, it starts rolling off, gets stuck on the side of whatever it is you're painting, they just fall apart. They swell up, they'll fall off the roller. And kind of the biggest issue that I've run into is that they don't apply an even, consistent thickness of coating. So every time, and I've tried about a half a dozen different style or brands of foam rollers, and the main problem that I've always had is that I'll try and squeeze, after you load up your foam roller, I'll try and squeeze out as much of that paint out of that roller as I can. No matter what I did, I'd roll it out and I would think that it's going on nice and thin. You do an area, you move on, you come back 5–10 minutes later, you got a curtain. No matter what I did, more reducer, less reducer, it didn't matter. I played with the ratios until I basically threw it in the garbage. Right? I've never ever had good luck using foam rollers. Now, the style roller that I personally prefer are your mohair style rollers, and those generally come in fairly thin naps, say like an 1/8 inch nap or like a 3/16 inch nap. They're not perfect. They do have one downfall, which is they can have a tendency to kind of shed some lint. Now, an easy workaround to that is to basically take the roller, wrap it up in tape, pull that tape off. Do that 3-4 times. You're going to pull off 99% of all the little fuzz on the outside face of that roller. And then when you start rolling your material out, you don't really have any issues. Now, the one thing that I like about the mohairs, one, the layer or the thickness of the coating that they put down is extremely consistent. It works. I've never had a sag or a run, well, unless I was a little heavy-handed on purpose. But I've never had a sag or a run using a mohair roller. And more importantly, or just as important, they don't fall apart. They don't swell. They don't fall apart. So my personal preference, I like to use the mohair style rollers. Again, with the understanding that you need to do a little bit of prep work to pull that fuzz off, before you start rolling out your paint. So now when we're talking about primers, there's basically two different types of primers. You've got your build primers, and then you've got your finishing primers. Now, I'm talking about this in a roll type application, not spraying. So now, keeping that into consideration, when you're trying to roll out, say, like a build type primer, it just doesn't work all that well. Build primers are really designed more so for spraying because they're a thicker consistency. Now, I mean, technically you can roll anything out, but it's going to leave you with a very textured surface. Now, finishing primers, on the other hand, they can roll out silky smooth. So when you're looking at this, when you're looking at doing your application with a roller, not spraying, but with a roller, your finishing primers, such as with Alexseal, they're 442. That's going to be the much better option. Now, setting that aside, now again talking about primers, there's two different colors of primers that you can get. You can either get what's called a gray or a white, and depending on what kind of paint or what color paint you're going to be, going with as your final finish, that will determine what color primer to use. So for example, if you're going to be doing a dark color, say like your dark greens, your blues, your reds, anything that's a nice, bright, vibrant color, generally speaking, you're going to want to use your gray primer, just because it's going to give you the best depth of color and the best color consistency. Now, when you're talking about lighter colors, some of your yellows, like I did on the Fighting Lady yellow, or any of your whites, light grays, whatever they may happen to be, light colors, you're going to want to use your white primer. If you try and use a light colored paint over top of a dark gray primer, you're going to have to apply probably 5 or 6 coats of paint to get that full hide. And if you ever have to do any repair work down the road, any little buff on a scratch here or there, you start wearing that paint a little bit thin, even though you've got plenty of paint thickness on there, it's still going to show some inconsistency. You're going to see a little bit of that gray starting to bleed through in spots. So you want to match your primer color to the paint that you're going to be using. Oh, and the one big point that this is just very important, you cannot skip this, and I made a point to talk about this in last week's video. Any surface that you're going to be painting over top has to be covered with a coat of primer. In areas last week where I had sanded down to bare glass, you could see that the color, even after 3 coats of the dark blue, the color was very inconsistent. Now, the areas that even had the slightest skim layer of primer looked fantastic. So if you're doing your sanding and you happen to burn through your primer coat, that's fine. That's not the end of the world. But you really need to come back, recoat that again with more primer, and be very careful on that area when you're sanding it back down smooth again. That's just, I can't stress that point hard enough here. Your paint has to go over top of primer. If your paint is going over top of, say, gel coat or even raw fiberglass, you're going to end up having to apply many more coats of paint than you really need to get that full coverage. So you've got all your primer down, you've gone over and you've applied a guide coat and then sanded everything down with 320. Now you're ready to start talking about paint. Now, Alexseal's, they're 501. They, as you know, they came out with a new rolling additive this year. They're 5018. And one of the questions that I had for them before I started this, because again, this was the first time I had used this product. It's a new product. It just came out this late spring, early summer. But one of the questions I had for them was that, well, do I use the 5018 on every single coat of paint that I apply, or just the final show coat? And they said, use it on every single coat. And I said, well, okay, well, why? So basically, as you saw, the 5018, it pops all the bubbles, helps the paint flow out into a smoother finish. Well, if you kind of extrapolate that a little bit, if you're rolling out, say, 2 or even 3 coats, the smoother that each coat can lay out, the less texture you're going to get in your surface. So if I had done the first 2 coats without that rolling additive, I would have had quite a bit more sanding ahead of me to actually get the final sanding for that final show coat. Whereas because I used the 5018, the rolling additive in every single coat, the amount of sanding that I needed to do was very, very minimal. And as far as I guess the overall painting process, what I found works very, very well is to do 2 initial coats, basically not wet on wet, but so roll out a coat and then wait a certain period of time, which I'll touch on here in a minute. Then apply a second coat with no sanding in between. Let that cure, do your final sanding with 400 grit, and then apply your last and final show coat. Now, as far as the amount of time that you wait in between coats, there's a number of variables that kind of play into this, as far as what kind of temperatures you're working in. Are you working in direct or indirect sunlight? Is there any kind of a breeze? Just a number of factors that kind of play into this, but generally speaking, if you wait, well, I was doing my painting in here and it was 65 degrees, 65, 68 degrees. So now if you roll out your first coat of paint, you wait 4 to 5 hours. You should be good to apply a second coat of paint directly over top, no sanding. Now you can technically, according to the application guide, Alexseal says that you can wait up to 16 hours before you need to kind of resand it. They're being very, very conservative with that number. I've talked with their tech guys, and they say that you can go up to 24. They recommend staying back to 16 just so that there's really no issues as far as bonding. Now I'm sure if you're out in 100-degree day and you went beyond that 16 hours, you might run into some problems. But for the average temperature, 65, 75 degrees. If you wait 4 or 5 hours between coats, you should be good. And that can be pushed out upwards of up to 24. Preferably, it'd be closer to 16. But point being, what I'm trying to get here is that if you time it right, if you get your first coat laid down in the morning, you can get a second coat laid down in that same day before you leave. Come back the following day, maybe even let it cure for a couple of days. Just so you want all the solvents to make sure that they've worked themselves out of the paint. But wait a day or 2, come back, do your final sanding with 400 grit, and then you should be good to apply your last and final show coat. Now, when rolling out this paint, it's pretty straightforward, but there is a little bit of technique to it. Now, just kind of real quick, I had mentioned this last week. Now, in general, whether it's this brand of paint or really any others, when you're rolling it out, you want to try and work the surface as little as possible. The more you work an area that's already been painted, the more you go over it with the roller, the faster the solvents are going to evaporate out of the paint. When enough of the solvents evaporate out of the paint, all of a sudden now you're going to find that your paint's not going to flow out and level quite as nicely as it should. So you want to apply the paint as evenly as you can without overworking the surface, I guess, if that makes any sense here. Now, as far as the amount of pressure, when you're applying the paint, you're rolling it out, just basically coating the surface. I generally find a light to medium pressure, pushing down with the roller. I find that works very, very well. So you worked over you applied the paint, spread it out. It looks like it's a nice, even coat. Now, the last thing that I like to do is with a very, very light hand, basically just essentially the weight of the roller itself. Just basically make one slow, basically smoothing roll or movement down all the way across. So work a section here and then move over another section, and literally you're moving the roller about this quickly. Just nice and smooth. Move over to the next section, hit that one, and again just continue over the area that you just coated. I generally find it works well to restrict the amount of area that you're working at any one time to about 2 square feet or less, or like a 2-foot wide section if you're doing the side of a hoe. So 2-foot section, top to bottom, or top of the railing down to the water line. So about 2 feet at a time, and then just basically work it in 2-foot chunks. Again, roll the material out using light to medium pressure, and then when you think you've got a good even coat, then make your final smoothing roll down each section with very, very light pressure, and that should work out very, very well, especially if you're using this 5018 additive. And the last thing I want to talk about is buffing compounds. You know, like say a dock jumped out of nowhere and kissed the side of your boat, left a little scratch on there, or you just had to do some minor repairs. The compounds that work best for actually buffing out the actual repair. Now, when we're talking about Alexseal, or even I've tried this on total boats that are wet edge, which is a really good one-part paint. The buffing compound that I have worked, or that I found that worked absolute best out of all the 3M brands, your McGuire brands, you name them, all the ones that I've tried. Granted, I haven't tried them all, but the ones that I've tried, the one that works best is actually this Total Boat. It's their Total Buff. Now, this, I believe, was originally designed to be used for buffing out gel coat, which it does a fantastic job at. I thought initially it was going to be a little bit too coarse for buffing out Alexseal when I was doing my testing about 5-6 months ago. But after about 2 days of a lot of frustration using every compound I could get my hand on, this was the one that actually got the job done. Using this compound along with a wool compounding buffing pad on a rotary type buffer, not one of these little vibrating jitterbug things, I'm not sure what they're actually called, but an actual rotary buffer. A wool compound pad with this compound, it will make quick work of smoothing out your repairs, any kind of sanding marks, scratch marks, that kind of things. So there are my top takeaways or must-know bits of info if you're going to be walking into a painting project like this. So I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you found this interesting. And if you did, please hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thank you in advance. I really appreciate that. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave those down below. I'll do my best to get back with you. And as always, thank you for your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. We're back on the Bertram. Have a great weekend.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.